So today I am finally going to try and do another shading tutorial. It's been a very long time since I did the first one. Yeah. If you follow me on Instagram, you might know this is actually the second time I've tried to record this, because the first time I recorded the whole thing and then I got to literally the end and I was like, oh, I didn't actually turn my mic on. So yeah, this is what my shading currently pretty much looks like. Yeah, for comparison, here's what my flat colour looks like. Yeah, flat colour shading. So the first step is literally blocking in the shading. Oh, for most of this I'm using the dry ink brush, by the way. This is also true of the line art and colouring. Yeah, the dry ink brush is the main one I use. The shading layer is clipped to the colour layer and underneath the line art layer, which is different from how I used to do my shading. I used to shade on top of the line art layer, but now I have the line art set to multiply, so I can shade under it basically, and just using a normal layer mode. So yeah, that's what the first layer will look like. So if I hide that, colour pick the base layer, and then I don't have an exact science in terms of picking the colours to use for shading. It's just whatever I feel looks good. But typically I'd move the colour wheels toward purple, via whatever the closest route to purple is, if that makes sense. Like if it was here, well, I guess that's pretty even either way. Let's say if it was here, I'd move it that way rather than move it toward green, because that's slightly further around to purple, I think. But yeah. So move it a little bit and then make it slightly darker. I tend to switch between the disc and classic, so I can move it here, and it's easier to figure out which way to move it toward purple from this bit. So yeah, and then just block in I'm not going to completely redraw all the shading, because I don't have time, but and you kind of get the idea from just watching me do these little bits, really, I think. And then yeah, same for pick another colour. Obviously if you've got a character with loads of different colours on it, this might not be the best method to use. Then possibly I'd go back to just doing it on a multiply layer, because it might get a bit much. But typically this is the method I try and use now. So yeah, once you've done the whole thing, and I do this on full opacity, by the way, it's not reduced at all. Then pick a slightly lighter version of the colour you're using for shading, and go back and just colour over it. So I'm kind of not being that neat with it, and I do it all on the same layer because I'm trying to go for the look you get if you used coloured pencils, or I guess crayon or pastels. So a textured look with the colours layered over each other. It doesn't always work out that it looks like that, but that is what I'm going for. That's too bright. Yeah, sometimes it takes me a couple of goes to get the colour I want. Like, I guess you could do this, I guess, on a separate layer, and that might be easier because you could play around with the opacity and stuff, but I just tend to do it all on one layer. So yes. Then I pick a third colour, but this time move the colour wheel to, well, in this case probably more toward orange, but so that it's more like pink or orange, depending on. And then go around the edges. Again, being kind of rough with it, not making it particularly neat, so that like the colour underneath shows through a bit. And I guess so that you have like a rough kind of gradient. That's the wrong brush. So yeah, it's easier for me to demonstrate on this. I move it back toward pink. For the third colour. Hopefully you get the idea. I'd probably actually make this slightly lighter. Again, after that, on the same layer, or you can do it on a different layer. It doesn't really matter, I just do it on the same layer because I'm lazy, I guess. Because I don't want loads of layers. Pick a slightly lighter colour than the actual base colour, not the shading colour, like the colour of the markings themselves. And do some highlights. I don't go too much brighter than the actual base colour for this because I add in brighter highlights on different layers. Again, I'm not super neat with this. Part of the reason I changed the way I shade is because I wanted more like texture in my art and stuff. The old way I was shading, it was all, well, my whole style, but the shading was quite smooth, and I don't know, I got kind of bored with that. I wanted some more like textured artwork. Maybe one day I'll go back to it all being smooth and clean. So yeah, hopefully you get the idea. Hide that there and go back to, yeah, I didn't get the colours quite right for this, but hopefully you got what I was trying to say. And then once the whole of the character is done, I add a layer on top of this shading, generally picking purple again because I like to shade in purple. Then using the soft brush, make a sort of gradient where you want darker area of the character to be. And then set that to multiply, or you could use like linear burn or colour burn, I guess. Whatever looks good to you. I use multiply. And then reduce the opacity to, again, whatever looks good. I think generally I use about between 30 to 60. But it depends on the character. Then I add like bounce lighting or sort of backlighting or lighting to like the darker area, in which a colour pick from the background. This is on a normal layer mode again. This time I do slightly reduce the opacity. Not massively, but just so you get the original colours come through a bit. Oh, I'm using the same brush to erase as to draw, by the way. So the dry ink brush. Yeah, and just add highlights to the darker areas of the character. I don't go too nuts with this. I find if you like add lightings like every bit, I don't know, it can sometimes look a bit too much, so these days try and use it a bit sparingly. I think because my style is fairly simple, it doesn't work that well if I add loads of extra detail. So I guess it depends a bit on your style. Like, do what you want. I'm just saying all this stuff as guidelines, but ultimately do whatever you feel looks good. Yep. Okay, when that's done, it looks kind of like that. And then on another layer, generally using the same colour, or if I had like a lighter background colour as well, I'd probably use that, but it's all kind of one colour, so I'm just sticking with the same colour. And then do brighter highlights where the lighting is coming from. For this I would typically use a different layer mode, but the exact mode varies. In this case I used soft light, but sometimes use add, sometimes colour dodge or screen. It's, yeah, whatever looks good. And again, like with the opacity, I'd reduce it based on what looks good. There's no set amount to reduce it. In this case, for this layer, I didn't reduce it at all. So it was already fairly pale. Fairly, yeah. It's not that bright, is what I meant to say. And yeah, same again. I don't go too nuts with it, but I do add maybe like more sort of highlights to the fur, like where the fur curves down or up. Here I might add more lighting to the eyes as well. I tend to do the eyes and like the nose and stuff all on the same layers as like the fur. I used to do the eyes separately. Yeah, I think for the old tutorial I was still doing eyes separately, so, but I don't now, I just do it all on the same layer using the same method. So, yep, when it's done it looks like that. And then above that I add another sort of soft layer of lighting. Typically I use pink because I like doing pink lighting. I feel it goes well with the purple of the shading. Using a soft brush again. Just add some areas of light. For this I used the add layer mode, but again it varies depending on what I think looks good. Now I keep the opacity for this fairly low. And then, I mean, that's kind of it. The rest is just adding like little extra bits. I tend to have a layer where I use the rosette brush to add some dots just for some extra texture. Again, I don't go too nuts with it. I used to a bit. When I first discovered this brush, I used it, like overused it. Yeah, I've toned it down a bit now. And then add like highlights and stuff. I feel I probably don't need to explain, like you could know how to draw in highlights, I'm sure. But yeah, like highlights on the hair and eyes. Again, using just a normal layer mode and the dry ink brush. And I take a grid brush, keep it on a fairly small size, and then just add some like extra little highlight. It kind of looks like sparkles, I think, so that's why I do it. But again, kind of sparingly, just where the brightest highlights are. And finally, I don't always do this, but if I feel the colour needs to be like unified a bit more, I'll add a layer where it's got a gradient, like colour fill. I think typically I do set that to soft light, but sometimes it's overlay. And then on a low opacity. And that's it. So, nothing too radical, I don't think. It's a fairly simple shading process. Though I'm not sure how well I explained it, so maybe it doesn't sound simple, but yeah, that's it. That's all I do for shading these days, so feel free to try that out if you're looking for a new method of shading. Yeah, I hope some people find that useful. Feel free to show me if you try it out. I like seeing when people follow my tutorials, so feel free to tag me or like message me or whatever. Yeah, good luck with all your art and life in general. I hope you're having a good 2023 so far. See you soon, I guess. Thanks for watching. Bye.